Normandy, June 8, 1944, 2 days after D-Day. The beach is still the beach. Smoke, wreckage, the particular smell of a place where catastrophic violence has just occurred and has not yet been cleaned up. The sand is wrong. The color of it is wrong. The things washed up on it are wrong. A young man walks ashore. He is 20 years old. He is wearing an American uniform. He carries a rifle he has been trained to use and a notebook he will use more. His name on his dog tags is Victor Brombert. That is not the name he was born with. He changed it during his military service, in response to a sense in his unit that a German name could be a liability in the event of capture. The name he was born with is German. He was born in Berlin. He grew up in Paris. He fled France in 1941 on a steamship carrying bananas with his parents at the last possible moment before the doors closed. He is 20 years old, walking onto a French beach that smells of the worst thing human beings do to each other, returning to the continent that tried to kill him. In his head, 3 languages run simultaneously: Russian, which his parents spoke at home, remnants of their life before the First War; French, which Paris gave him; German, which Berlin put in him before he was old enough to understand what Berlin was becoming. The German is the one that matters today, because somewhere ahead of him, behind the bocage and the hedgerows, and the German defensive positions that are going to cost the Allied armies months of brutal fighting to dislodge, there are men who speak it natively. And it is Brombert's job to sit across a table from those men and hear what they know. Not just the words, what the words mean. This is the difference. This is the thing that cannot be manufactured in a training program or compensated for with a dictionary. You cannot learn a language well enough to hear what it is hiding. You can only be born into it. Brombert was born into it. He was 20 years old on a Normandy beach, and he was about to become one of the most effective intelligence assets the United States Army deployed in the entire European campaign. The story of how that happened begins 3 years earlier, in the mountains of Maryland. Before there were Ritchie Boys, there was a problem. The United States Army in 1942 was, by any objective measure, a military force preparing for a war it did not fully understand. It had manpower. It was building equipment at a rate that would eventually dwarf Axis production. It had the industrial base of the largest economy in the world behind it. What it did not have was battlefield intelligence. Not the strategic kind, the kind that comes from breaking codes and intercepting transmissions, which the code breakers at Bletchley Park and the American Signals Intelligence Services were doing with increasing effectiveness. The tactical kind, the kind that answers the question a company commander needs answered in the next 4 hours. Where is the machine gun nest? How many men are holding the next ridge? What is the state of the unit that is about to try to kill my soldiers? That intelligence comes from one primary source: the men you capture. And capturing a man and extracting useful information from him in the time available, before the tactical situation changes, before the intelligence becomes stale, before the window closes, requires something that the American Army did not have in sufficient supply in 1942. Native German speakers. Not people who had studied German, people who had grown up in it, who understood not just the vocabulary and the grammar, but the cultural architecture, the way a Bavarian speaks differently from a Prussian, the way an SS officer carries himself in captivity differently from a Wehrmacht conscript from the Rhineland, the way a man who is lying in German sounds different from a man who is lying in a language he learned in a classroom. General George Marshall recognized this gap in the spring of 1941. He sent observers to Britain, which had been at war for 2 years and had developed interrogation capabilities the Americans were years behind. The observers came back with a recommendation: build a centralized training facility for intelligence work. Train interrogators. Find the people who have the native knowledge and put it to use. The Secretary of War approved the plan in May 1942. Camp Ritchie, Maryland. a former National Guard training facility in the mountains near the Pennsylvania border. Secluded, out of the way, exactly the kind of place you put something you want nobody to talk about. The Army began looking for recruits. It found them in the most unexpected place, the refugee camps. They came from everywhere the Reich had reached, from Berlin and Vienna and Frankfurt and Munich, from Prague and Warsaw and Budapest, from the great university cities of Central Europe, where Jewish intellectual life had flourished for generations before the 1930s turned it to ash. They were doctors' sons and lawyers' sons and professors' sons. They were young men who had grown up in apartments full of books and dinner tables full of argument and streets full of culture, and who had watched everything their parents built get stripped away. First the jobs, then the businesses, then the citizenship, then the neighbors, then in some cases, the parents themselves. They arrived in America with what refugees arrive with: nothing visible and everything interior. Languages, education, the specific bone-deep knowledge of a culture that you acquire not by studying it, but by living inside it for the formative years of your existence. The Army wanted that knowledge. It was, for many of them, the most complicated thing that had ever been asked of them. They had fled Germany. They had built new lives in America, or were trying to, or were still in the process of trying when Pearl Harbor happened, and the Army came to them and said, "We need you to go back." Not back to Germany exactly, back to Europe, back to the language, back into proximity with the men and the ideology and the uniform that had taken everything from them or their families. And they said yes. More than 2,800 German-born Jews trained at Camp Ritchie. Out of more than 19,000 total trainees from 70 countries, this group, the Jewish refugees who had the deepest knowledge of the enemy and the most personal reason to use it, became the center of what the Army was building. They trained in interrogation techniques, in counterintelligence, in psychological warfare, in the specific art of getting a prisoner to tell you what he knows before he decides not to. They practiced on actual German prisoners of war brought to Camp Ritchie for the purpose. They built replica German villages and interrogated mock civilians in full-scale German homes. They trained until the thing they were doing felt like conversation, because conversation was what it had to be. Not torture, not coercion. Something more precise and more devastating than either: understanding. Victor Brombert was born in Berlin in 1923 to Russian Jewish parents who had fled the revolution during the First World War. His earliest language was Russian, spoken at home. His second was German, spoken everywhere else in Berlin. His third was French, acquired when Hitler's rise to power in 1933 moved the family to Paris, where Brombert grew up, attended the lycée, fell in love with French literature, and became, in the specific way that adolescence works, Parisian. He was 17 when the Germans came to Paris. He was 18 when the family left, on the steamship with the bananas, the last route out, the door closing behind them. He arrived in America in 1941. He enrolled in school. He was drafted in 1943, and because he spoke Russian, German, and French with native fluency, 3 languages that covered the primary theaters of the war and the primary languages of its prisoners, he was assigned to Camp Ritchie. He trained as an interrogator. He was 20 years old when he landed on Omaha Beach 2 days after D-Day, attached to Patton's 2nd Armored Division. What followed was 2 years of combat intelligence work that took him through every major battle the Americans fought in Europe. Normandy, the liberation of Paris, the city he had loved and fled. The Hürtgen Forest, which he would later describe as one of the most ferocious and terrible engagements of the entire war. The Battle of the Bulge. In every one of these campaigns, Brombert sat across tables from German prisoners and talked to them. He talked to them the way you talk to someone you have known your whole life, because, in a sense, he had. He spoke their language from the inside. He knew the idioms and the regional accents and the class markers and the political vocabulary of a society he had grown up adjacent to. He could hear the difference between a man who was concealing something and a man who had nothing left to conceal. The questions were always tactical. Where is the machine gun nest? How many men are holding the next ridge? Where are your reserve units? What is the condition of the formation to your left? The answers, when they came in German. And the translation, always in every interrogation, was the moment where everything rested. Here is the thing about translating in a combat interrogation that no language course teaches and no field manual can fully contain. The words are not the intelligence. The words are the container. The intelligence is what the words reveal about the state of the man saying them, his knowledge, his fear, his training, his willingness to conceal, and about the state of the force he belongs to. A prisoner says, "Our regiment is holding the tree line at grid reference 447. A literal translation produces, "Our regiment is holding the tree line at grid reference 447. But a native speaker hearing that sentence hears something else simultaneously. He hears the tense, present tense, which means now, which means the prisoner believes this to still be true. He hears the word for regiment, which carries specific connotations in the German military vocabulary about size and organization. He hears the confidence or lack of confidence in the assertion, the tiny hesitation before tree line that might mean the prisoner is guessing, or the slight overcorrection in the voice that often signals a man saying something he has been trained to say rather than something he knows. The literal translation loses all of this. The Ritchie Boys didn't translate literally, they translated completely. They gave the interrogation report not just what was said, but what it meant. The assessment of the prisoner's reliability, the confidence level of the specific intelligence, the indicators of unit morale and physical condition that a trained native speaker extracts from a conversation that a translator with a dictionary simply cannot. This is why they produce 60% of the actionable intelligence on the Western Front. Not because there were more of them than other intelligence assets. There weren't. 11,000 trained at Camp Ritchie over the course of the war, deployed across an entire theater of operations. That is a thin force spread across an enormous front. They produced 60% because the intelligence they produced was actually usable. It came with context. It came with assessment. It came from people who could hear what a German prisoner was actually saying rather than what his words appeared to say. And sometimes, in the specific, high-stakes circumstances of tactical combat interrogation, what the prisoner was saying and what the translator was supposed to report were not the same thing. The scenario that defines the moral architecture of the Ritchie Boys' work is not exotic. It happened in variations across every major engagement they participated in, whenever the information flowing in one direction through an interrogation created a collision with the information flowing in the other. Consider the structure of the problem. A German prisoner is being interrogated. He is providing information. The interrogator, a Ritchie boy, a native German speaker, someone who can hear every layer of what is being said, is receiving that information and is supposed to transmit it accurately to the American command structure. But accurate transmission requires judgment, always. The question is not whether to apply judgment. Every act of translation applies judgment, but whether to apply it transparently or invisibly. Transparently, I am translating this sentence accurately, and I am also noting that I believe the prisoner is uncertain about this specific detail. Invisibly, I am translating this sentence in a way that accounts for my assessment of its reliability without explicitly flagging the assessment. Every translator makes this choice dozens of times in every interrogation. The question is not whether to make it. The question is where to draw the line. For the Ritchie Boys operating in combat conditions, where the interrogation report goes directly into an operational plan that will be executed in hours, where there is no time for a second opinion or a methodological review, the line was not always where the training manual had placed it. Guy Stern, one of the most decorated Ritchie Boys, whose interrogations were credited by military officials with saving over 3,000 American lives by exposing German mines and booby traps in occupied France, described the weight of the decision in terms that acknowledged its complexity without offering a resolution. You are the only person in the room who can hear what is actually being said. That is power. What you do with it is your responsibility. Nobody else can check your work. Victor Brombert survived the war. He walked off the beaches of Normandy and through the liberation of Paris and out of the Hürtgen Forest and out of the Bulge and into the denazification process in Germany that followed the surrender, where he worked as an interpreter and interrogator, processing the end of the regime that had expelled him as a child. He went home to America. He enrolled at Yale on the GI Bill, bachelor's degree in 1948, PhD in Romance Languages and Literatures in 1953, Fulbright Fellowship in Rome, 25 years at Yale, then Princeton, where he became the Henry Putnam University Professor of Romance in Comparative Literatures, one of the most distinguished chairs in American academic life. He wrote 15 books: French Literature of the 19th and 20th Centuries, The History of Ideas, Problems in Narrative, The Relationship Between Experience and Language, which he understood from the inside better than almost anyone who had ever held an academic appointment. He was revered by his students not just for his scholarship, but for something harder to name: a quality of presence, an ability to speak about literature, about Flaubert and Stendhal and Hugo and the great tradition of French letters, as if it mattered in the way that things that have cost you something matter. Not as text to be analyzed, but as ways of surviving the world. He burst into operatic song and lectures. He was known for his worldly charisma. He had landed on Omaha Beach at the age of 20. He did not talk about the war very much. This was common among the Ritchie Boys, men who had done something that could not be fully explained to people who had not been there, in a unit that had been classified until the year 2000, carrying memories that were not always convertible into the currency of normal conversation. The story of the Ritchie Boys was classified until 2000. So for half a century, the men who had produced 60% of the actionable battlefield intelligence on the Western Front could not tell anyone what they had done. They went to graduate school and built careers and raised families and lived their lives. And the thing that defined them more than anything else was something they were not permitted to speak about. Brombert appeared in a 60 Minutes profile in 2021 when he was 97 years old. He described the fear, he described the training, he described landing on Normandy and the specific shock of finding yourself in a place where terror is not abstract. I realized that I was afraid. I never calculated that there is such a thing as terror, fear, so I experienced viscerally fear. He did not describe the interrogations in detail. He answered the questions that were asked. He kept, as he had always kept, the specific weight of the specific decisions in the specific rooms where they were made. He died on November 26, 2024, in Princeton, New Jersey. He was 101 years old. To understand what Victor Brombert and the other Ritchie Boys were doing, you have to understand the specific architecture of how battlefield intelligence works in practice. An interrogation produces a report. The report goes to the intelligence officer attached to the unit, who assesses it and forwards what is relevant to the operational command. The operational command incorporates it into planning. The planning becomes action. Men live or die based on the accuracy of the report at the beginning of this chain. In the American Army of 1944, the interrogation report was the product of a translation. The interrogator heard German and produced English. The English was what the intelligence officer read. The intelligence officer was not a native German speaker. He could not go back and check the translation against the original. He received the report as a document and worked with it as a document. This means the interrogator, the person at the beginning of the chain, held a specific kind of authority that was largely invisible in the chain of command. He was not a senior officer. Brombert was a junior enlisted man for most of the war. He did not sit in the command tent where the operational decisions were made. He sat in the interrogation tent where the raw material for those decisions was produced. But the raw material was the intelligence, and the intelligence was only as accurate or as useful, which is not always the same thing, as the judgment of the man who produced it. The Ritchie boys understood this. They had been trained at Camp Ritchie to understand it. The training emphasized not just the mechanics of interrogation, but the responsibility that went with it. You are the filter through which information passes from the enemy to your commanders. How you filter it determines what your commanders can do. David Fry, the West Point historian who has studied the Ritchie boys in more depth than anyone currently active in the field, described it precisely. 60+% of the actionable intelligence gathered on the battlefield was gathered by Ritchie boys. They made a massive contribution to essentially every battle that the Americans fought. The entire sets of battles on the Western Front. 60%. From a unit that most Americans had never heard of until the year 2000. From men who had fled the country whose soldiers they were now questioning. From interrogators sitting in tents in farmhouses and field stations across France and Belgium and Germany, asking the questions that kept other men alive. There is a dimension to what the Ritchie boys were doing that no training manual could address and no field report could capture. They were German Jews interrogating German soldiers, not metaphorically, literally. Men who had grown up in the same cities, who had attended the same kinds of schools, who had eaten the same foods and spoken the same language and lived in the same cultural world, until one of them had been forced out and the other had stayed and put on a different uniform. In some cases, the distance was narrower than that. Some Ritchie boys interrogated prisoners who came from their own cities, their own neighborhoods, who might have known their families, who were certainly products of the same cultural milieu that had expelled them. The psychology of that situation is not containable in an operational report. Consider what it required. To sit across a table from a man in a uniform representing an ideology that had murdered your relatives, an ideology that classified you as subhuman, that had stripped your family of citizenship and livelihood and safety, and to conduct a professional interrogation. To extract information with the calm, patient, methodical approach of a trained intelligence officer. To not let the personal weight of what you were doing collapse the professional function of it. Some of the Ritchie boys used the personal dimension as a tool. Guy Stern would dress as a Russian officer to leverage German prisoners' fear of Soviet captivity. Others would draw on their cultural knowledge to build the kind of rapport that makes a prisoner feel, momentarily, that he is talking to someone who understands him, because he is. Others kept the personal dimension entirely separate from the professional one, in the way that surgeons keep the weight of what they are doing separate from the mechanical precision it requires. Brombert described learning, on the beaches of Normandy, that he was afraid. He did not describe what it cost him to sit across from German soldiers in the weeks that followed and do his job. That is the silence where the real weight lives. The number that defines the Ritchie boys' contribution, 60% of actionable battlefield intelligence on the Western Front, is drawn from a U.S. Army report published in 1946. It is a large number. It becomes larger when you understand what it means in practice. The Allied campaign in Western Europe from D-Day in June 1944 to Germany's surrender in May 1945 involved hundreds of major engagements, tens of thousands of tactical decisions, and millions of individual moments where the difference between a right choice and a wrong one was measured in lives. Every tactical decision that was informed by accurate intelligence was, to some degree, informed by what the Ritchie boys had produced. The German minefields in France that Guy Stern's interrogations exposed. The German defensive dispositions in the Hürtgen Forest that Brombert and his colleagues assessed. The German reserve positions in the Ardennes that intelligence work before and during the Bulge helped identify. The German order of battle at every major engagement, The unit designations, the troop strengths, the condition of the forces, the morale of the men, that the Ritchie Boys extracted from prisoners who, in many cases, did not realize how much they were giving away. Some scholars believe the Ritchie Boys helped end World War II 2 years early. This is the kind of counterfactual that cannot be proven. History does not run experiments. You cannot subtract the Ritchie Boys from the Western Front and measure what would have happened differently. But the 60% number is real. The Army measured it, the Army reported it, and behind every percentage point is a man in a tent or a farmhouse, asking a question in German, hearing the answer with every layer of cultural and linguistic knowledge his childhood had given him, and deciding, in real time, with no ability to consult upward, how to translate what he had heard into the English that would reach the command post and become the plan. The story of the Ritchie Boys was classified until 2000. 55 years. The men who had produced 60% of the actionable intelligence on the Western Front came home, enrolled in universities on the GI Bill, built careers in academia and law, in medicine and government, and were not permitted to tell anyone what they had done. Victor Brombert became one of the most celebrated professors of literature in America. He taught Flaubert and Stendhal and Hugo and the great tradition of French letters for half a century at Yale and Princeton, and his students knew him as a brilliant, charismatic, opera-singing professor who had something about him, a quality of having been somewhere and come back, that they couldn't quite name. They didn't know about Normandy. They didn't know about the Hürtgen Forest. They didn't know about the interrogation tents. In 2022, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum presented the Ritchie Boys with the Elie Wiesel Award, its highest honor. It was 77 years after the war ended. Stuart Eisenstadt, shortly before becoming chairman of the museum, said, "The Ritchie Boys were one of World War II's greatest secret weapons for U.S. Army intelligence. Many had fled Nazi Germany but returned as American soldiers, deploying their knowledge of German language and culture to great advantage. They significantly helped the war effort and saved lives. They significantly helped the war effort and saved lives." This is the language of official recognition, careful and measured and true. It does not contain what it cost them to go back. It does not contain what they heard in the interrogation tents. It does not contain the specific weight of translating from a language you grew up in, for people who were trying to kill the men you had become on the same continent that had expelled you as a child. That weight is not containable in an award citation. It lived in the men. Brombert carried it to 101. The story of the Ritchie Boys and of Victor Brombert contains a principle that institutions find uncomfortable and individuals find clarifying. The most valuable knowledge is always the knowledge that looks like something else. The Army was looking for soldiers in 1942. It had soldiers. What it didn't have, what it recognized eventually that it desperately needed, was something that didn't fit the category of soldier at all. It needed people who had been somewhere, who had lived inside a culture and absorbed it at the level where it becomes instinct rather than information, who could hear what a German prisoner was actually saying rather than what his words appeared to say. That knowledge lived in the refugees, not in the academies, not in the training programs, in the people who had been expelled from a country that was now the enemy and who had carried that country's language and culture with them through exile and across an ocean and into the American Army and back to Europe. The Army almost didn't recruit them. The initial instinct of institutions is to reach for the familiar, the graduate of the officer candidate school, the man with the appropriate credentials, the person who fits the existing category. What saved lives in the interrogation tents was something that no credential program produces. It was the specific, irreplaceable knowledge of a man who had grown up speaking German in Berlin and fled to Paris and crossed the Atlantic on a banana boat and returned to Normandy as a 20-year-old American soldier. You cannot train that. You can only recognize it when it appears and put it to work. The Ritchie Boys produced 60% of the actionable intelligence on the Western Front. They did it in a language that had been used to expel them. They did it in the service of a country that had taken them in. They did it without recognition for 55 years. And one of them, a small, brilliant, opera-singing professor of French literature at Princeton, carried the weight of it to the age of 101, and then put it down and left. The questions he asked in those interrogation tents, in the forests of Belgium and the fields of France, the answers he heard, the translations he made, they are the reasons some men came home. The men never knew it. The professor never said. The intelligence was actionable. The rest was silence.